Good evening, everyone, and welcome wherever you are. My name is Philip Steenkamp, and I'm the President and Vice Chancellor of Royal Roads University. And thank you so much for being with us for another virtual edition of our Changemakers Speakers Series. Today, our guest of honor is BC Public Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry. I would like to start by acknowledging that our campus is located on the traditional lands of the Kosapsan and Lekwungen ancestors and families. And it is with great gratitude that we live, work, and learn on these lands. Haishka Siem. Now, I'm so glad you can join us today. Please feel free to chat with each other online, and please type your questions for Dr. Henry in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can a little later. So let's get started. This speakers series was initially conceived as a celebration of Royal Roads' 25th anniversary. Originally, we had plans to bring these dynamic sessions off our campus and out into the greater Victoria community. But, as Dr. Henry can tell you, a pandemic has a way of interfering with the best laid plans. However, we certainly do not hesitate to take on big challenges at Royal Roads. And this series is about exactly those types of challenges. Things like climate change, racial justice, inequality, technological change, and of course, a pandemic that changed the very nature of how we live and work for well over a year. So how do we develop the perseverance and resilience it takes to wrestle these wicked problems? That is what we want to examine, and that is what we want to teach. And while much of the previous year was spent learning and working online through a screen, we have not sacrificed connection or caring, and I am tremendously proud of that achievement. Our extraordinary campus has also been a place throughout the pandemic for people to come and visit, to relax, and to recharge. I am so often cheered by the sight of friends or families meeting up for time spent together outdoors. Knowing that we could still see familiar faces outside safely was one of the small saving graces of this pandemic. And that was the guidance that Dr. Bonnie Henry provided. For so many of us, she truly needs no introduction at this point. Her calm and authentic demeanor comes through at every single briefing. She is the author of Soap and Water and Common Sense. What a fantastic title for a book. And of course, Be Kind, Be Calm, Be Safe, about the first days of the pandemic in BC, which she co-authored with her sister while on holidays during the pandemic. In 2003, she was the operational lead in response to the SARS outbreak in Toronto. And her international work includes a polio eradication program in Pakistan and work with the World Health Organization to control the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. She is truly a specialist in public health and preventative medicine. She holds an honorary Doctor of Laws from Royal Roads, something of which we are tremendously proud, in recognition of her extraordinary leadership and commitment to public information. Her leadership and advice have gotten both institutions, individuals, and communities through one of the biggest challenges in living memory. And I'm so incredibly grateful and honored to introduce to you today, Dr. Bonnie Henry.
Honor to be here with you today and to acknowledge with gratitude that we are here on the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, now the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation, and I do also recognize that with gratitude every day. So today for my words, my talk, we titled it Pandemic Perseverance, and I had to look up, what is perseverance? What is it that we have been through? And the definitions are varied, but they start with persistence in doing something, despite difficulty or delay in achieving success, continued effort to do or achieve something, despite difficulties, failure, or opposition, to achieve something despite difficulty or discouragement. It's the quality of someone who doesn't give up no matter what, a person who can endure pain or hardship without showing their feelings or complaining, a stoic. Some of the words that are used are dedication, determination, endurance, grit, moxie or spunk, or stamina or tenacity. Is it a positive trait, perseverance? Since challenges are inevitably in a part of our world, perseverance is an extremely valuable trait. It's more than a professional skill, I believe. It's a life skill. And it is a life skill that we have learned and honed together in this last 18 months. A skill that will stay with us as we move through our lives, that we are ever so slowly getting back to. And a skill that I believe we need to harness and use to address those many challenges that this pandemic has exposed to us. But it's also true that we have not all had the same experience in this pandemic. And that too is something we need to acknowledge and to carry with us as we move into our pandemic recovery. We have all suffered losses and have been called upon to sacrifice for our common ways, for our common good, in ways that are small and large in this last 18 months. Where I come from, we have a saying that common suffering builds strong bonds. But again, this loss has not affected us equally. We have persevered, and we have witnessed each other's suffering in this storm. And I believe it is this connection that you and I must now remember as we enter a new phase and see this storm ebb. Rachel Carson, who is the author of the book Silent Spring, said, "Most of us walk unseeing through the world, unaware alike of its beauties, its wonders, and the tragic intensity of the lives being lived about us." This year and a half has been a time of reckoning and of witnessing, and it has revealed much that we cannot help but see more clearly. First and foremost, the scale of inequity and injustice that we have in our society. That women, racialized communities, Indigenous peoples, and youth have suffered disproportionately from this virus, from COVID-19, but also from those measures we have imposed to quell this storm that we've been dealing with around the globe, often because of inequities that have existed long before this pandemic began. We saw this in how the virus caused so much suffering in our long-term care homes, where our most vulnerable seniors and elders were so affected, and their caregivers and families and our communities suffered. When we faced the unknown with fear and anxiety, before we had the possibility of vaccines, it seems so long ago now, our world slowed down, and this led us to see the world around us in more detail, in a way that we may never have seen before. The work of so many, from grocery store workers to garbage collectors, to our educators, the importance of childcare workers, to the essential workers in healthcare and policing and public safety, to the joy of seeing our family and friends, to the all-important tech support or that teenager who figured out how to use Zoom for you. For some, it was a welcome reprieve at first, at least for a short term. But for many of us, it was a massive challenge from the very beginning. We know from a health perspective that substance use increased, interfamily violence, interpersonal violence increased, food insecurity soared in communities around our province. Social responses to crises like these brought out the worst, but also the best in human nature. There were people that retreated to anxiety and control and prevention, avoidance and denial. There were many of us who wanted to fly or escape. Heaven knows there were times when I wanted to leave until I realized there was no place in the world to go. There was the unfortunate blaming and scapegoating and stigma that happened in communities across our province. But thankfully, there was also altruism, us coming together, that sense of collective support and common experience. We persevered. When misinformation and fear filled gaps, every miracle cure held up as the solution, every small study telling us something different and giving false promise that there was some one easy way out of this. Vaccines had arrived, but we didn't yet know if they would really protect those who were most at risk and for how long, and were they safe? And then the supply was a trickle, and we couldn't get enough fast enough. But we persevered. And then as the crisis continued and new twists and turns hit us, from more transmissible variants to that ennui and fatigue and loneliness that set in, that we wanted it to be over, that we never wanted to hear "you're on mute" ever again, wanting desperately for things to be different than they were. That was when our resilience was really tested. It was a time that I called vaccine hope and pandemic reality. In February, March, and April of this year, that was when new strains came sweeping through and that took advantage of any small lapse in those measures that we knew how to do by then. Everyone knew that we needed to wash our hands, keep a safe distance, wear a mask, stay home if you were sick, no gatherings, work from home, COVID safety plans. We were tired of these, all of these. But as human behavior is, there were lapses, and that, unfortunately, led to more people getting sick. We were in the middle of hard, and Winston Churchill said, "In the middle, everything looks like failure." We wanted it to be different, for the virus not to be spreading again, for our hospitals and ICUs not to be filling up even as the healthcare workers were exhausted. We were sick of staying home, keeping our distance, and getting tested, and Zoom meetings, and still not enough vaccine. But that is when we persevered. We went back to those essential elements of humanness, that connection, compassion, community, when kindness became that essential element of our daily life, our superpower, to overcome that denial and disbelief and second-guessing that was relentless. Perseverance got us through that most difficult time, that dark heart of this past winter. And we saw that we also had science in action. And that was our light growing stronger on the horizon. But we had to remember that change was also a source of both hope and, for many people, fear. And we saw that that could lead to anxiety and alarm. And for many who were tired of everything that we were going through, it meant lashing out in anger. And many of us felt that anger, or becoming paralyzed with anxiety. But we must also know that science is not static or absolute. Innovation, new thinking, new solutions only come with challenge and change. Science in action required us to learn as we go, and we need to continue doing that. But changing our course and our advice as our knowledge grew during that time was also a source of stress and anxiety for many. It was not always easy to accept in that time of relentless uncertainty. But the vaccines we had did work. And not only did they worked on our seniors and elders, and they were protected. Our long-term care homes were protected, and that protection was strong. These are the things that we learned as we were making it through this spring. The vaccines were working, and they were safe. As we received more vaccine, being able to provide this protection to those most at risk, starting with our elders and seniors in our community, with First Nations communities around this province, with Indigenous people in every part of the province. Every week as more vaccine arrived, the fear and frustration was replaced with hope and light, seeing an end to this common suffering. And we persevered. It became a little lighter. And I don't know if everybody else here remembers, but the day that I got my first vaccine, that feeling of light and relief and joy at the immunization clinics. And I talked to many of my exhausted ICU physician friends and nursing friends who volunteer for shifts at the immunization clinics because it lifts their spirit after all of the sadness and the suffering they saw. So now we're at 80%. 80% of people over the age 12 in this province have been immunized to protect them, to protect themselves, to protect their families, and to protect our community. When have we ever had 80% agreement on anything? It really is a miracle. Despite the changing recommendations and supply and products and concerns, we have reached a level of protection now in our community across this province that there is an end to this pandemic, and it is in sight. because we persevered. It is hard from my perspective to have watched that curve go up and not knowing how high or how long it would, knowing that every number was a person who was cared for, who was loved, who would be missed. Knowing that we can never get things exactly right, and that our challenge was to do just enough to stop the virus and not too much that it was going to overwhelm and increase the burden on those who already had lost the most. As we emerge into the light, though, we need more than ever to remember that our journeys of this last year and a half have all been different. We have witnessed each other's suffering at one level, but we will always have this common bond. But we do not know everybody's story, whether it was a fraught relationship at home, losing a loved one who passed away in isolation, not being able to bear witness to those important moments of transition in life, not being able to hold a grandchild, and the deep community traumas that we have seen from Black Lives Matter to the unspeakable tragedy of children in unmarked graves, and the profound sadness and trauma that that knowledge has triggered. And now we are seeing impacts of things like climate change disrupting our lives, from heat to wildfires to smoke. And we think, and now this. But we will and we must persevere. And as we continue to move out of the pandemic and return to life, we must be patient with ourselves and with each other. We all need time to adjust, to get over our past histories together, and to respect the need that we all have to go at our own pace. Be kind, be calm, be safe is more important than ever. And now more than ever, we need to harness the compassion and resilience we have witnessed to address those inequities and injustices that have been exposed, to not go back to walking unseeing through the world, to use these bonds of common suffering to lift each other up, to build a stronger community that is more just, to actually make meaningful movement on reconciliation. Vaccines are the way out of this pandemic, but only we have the power of hope and healing to change from this time of relentless uncertainty to unrelenting kindness. And I think that is what we have learned because we have persevered. Thank you.
Dr. Henry, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk about perseverance. And please come and join me here on the stage, and we have some questions for you. So we're going to talk for a little longer with Dr. Henry, and if you have questions for her, please ask them in the comments, and we will ask a few of them a little later on. Now, Dr. Henry, we're also accustomed to seeing you at the podium for your pandemic briefings, of course, but we have a couple of images today that show you in quite a different light. You had quite a naval career, serving as a medical officer, even though I hear you get quite seasick. So my question is, how much does your military training come into effect when handling an emergency like the opioid crisis or the pandemic?
Yes, it was a challenging time, and I did indeed get quite motion sick in all kinds of things that move. But I did learn a lot in the military, and you learn about leadership in a very personal way. But I think one of the things that I take with me in terms of responding to the pandemic and crises is the fact that making a decision is important. And as a leader, you must make a decision. And sometimes we have to make the best decision we can with imperfect information. And that is not always something people are comfortable with. And you have to be able to take responsibility for those decisions. Not making a decision has impacts. And those can be as deadly as making a decision. So, those are in times of, in peacetime as we call it, making a decision, being collaborative, getting all of the information possible, taking the time is really important. And that's how you get to really good long-term decisions about different programs. But in a crisis, you do have to make decisions with imperfect information. And that is something that I learned as a leader in the military.
Can I ask you just a little follow-up on that one? Public health is a science. Obviously it's a science and it's evidence-based, but watching you, I think it's also an art, and intuition is important. Is that how you experienced it as well, or how you experienced it?
I do think there is an art to it. It's an art to, I think it was, there now I've just a lot, but it'll come back to me, who said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it.
Right.
And it's true. We do need to take complex things and put them together. But yes, it's, I don't know if it's so much intuition, but experience. When you've seen these things before, when you get the best advice from the people that you know have that piece of knowledge, but to be able to pull it together and to say, well, this is what we need to do now. And it's not always easy to describe, but there is absolutely an art to it.
Yeah, thank you. And we have another image as well. So, being in the spotlight every day as you are, and as you have been now for 18 months, takes an incredible amount of self-awareness. And I think you handle it incredibly well, as evidenced by this campaign you were in for Science World. So how do you cultivate your own sense of calm before the cameras switch on?
Before people can see the panic in my eyes. This is, I still get very, very nervous every time I'm talking in public, and I forget words like, but it is really, I think about my responsibility, my job is to try and provide the best information for people, because we know that if we tell people what we need them to do, we tell them why we need them to do it, and give them the background so they understand, and then give people the means to do what we want them to do. That's how we bring people along. And I've been in many crises in the past, and it really, I've learned that the communication is the key to it. And again, all tragedy is a failure of communication, as Eisenhower said, I believe it was. But we need to. It is about recognizing that I have that role to play, but I can tell you that I get nervous every time.
Yeah, well, I do too. And one of the things I've learned through the pandemic, because I couldn't communicate in the same way with the university community, was just how important that empathy was, trying to understand what people were thinking and feeling and going through. And clearly that's, something which you have demonstrated, I think, so admirably through all of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It has been a challenge. I mean, early on we had media in the room with us, a lot of media in the room with us, but then in the last year and a bit, it really has been talking to a relatively empty room with a camera. So you don't get to see those facial expressions, and it's quite exciting actually to be here with you in person because it has been a long time, and you really appreciate how much we get from our interpersonal connections and being with somebody in real.
I know that there is no substitute for being in person, as you say. I mean, just being able to read the body language and the cues. And so I'm delighted we could do this in person without an audience, but still, that's just one step towards having an audience, I suppose. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about, and these came up, I think, in the context of your talk to some extent, but you could tell me a little bit about your core guiding principles and how you apply them in your work.
Yeah, I do actually believe that being true to your core guiding principles is important, and it's something I've thought quite a lot about over the years. And I think the ones that stick with me, of course, are patience. In patience lies wisdom, and that's one of the phrases that I say quite a lot. I think humility is incredibly important. Bringing out the best in others and being able to learn and change and grow, those are things that I believe are really important. And compassion. You know, compassion and love and kindness are words that we don't necessarily equate with leadership, with that vision or that image. But I do believe that those are core values that help you make the right decisions in very stressful situations.
Yeah, and that's, I think, been so evident in the way you've kind of led through this pandemic. Here at Royal Roads, just before the pandemic, we developed a new vision, inspiring people with the courage to change the world, with 3 values of caring, creativity, and courage. And I can't tell you how much they guided our thinking and our actions through this last 18 months. It was quite incredible. I really began to understand how those guiding principles or values are so important. And hopefully that's one of the lessons we can take forward as we move.
And courage, I think in many small ways, so many people showed courage in this last 18 months. They were brave. Brave for some people meant getting up in the morning. It has been such a change for so many people, and no more so than young people, especially young adults in that transitional time of their life. And I worry a lot, and I have so much admiration for the people who finished high school, the young people in my life, the people who went to university this year, even though they didn't make those connections, and the so much of that interaction of university that they need. And you know, this is why vaccine is our passport back to getting those connections back, and how important that is.
Yeah. Well, I know from personal experience, my daughter's starting post-secondary this year, just an entirely different experience than I had. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So some other questions we have for you. I'm sort of interested in to what extent you could tell us a little bit about, and you mentioned this in the speech, some of the lessons we've learned and how we take those forward. And, we've got a whole number of crises right now we're dealing with. We went through this incredible heat wave as an example, and we've got the fires now. And I think the temptation is for all of us to kind of relax and, hope that life goes back to normal. But we've clearly got some big challenges ahead of us. So what kind of lessons do you think we can kind of draw from our experience of the last 18 months to apply to these challenges?
Yeah, I think some of the things that I hope we've taken out of this are that, I remember early on I said, it's not forever, it's just for now. But for now turned out to be a long time for a lot of people. But the fact that we can get through this, and some of the things that helped us get through this were connecting with people. I believe resilience, our personal resilience, is really part of our community resilience, and that we need to lift each other up through these difficult times. And we've done that. And that's beating back on that, remembering that we have this resilience in us now, that we have this perseverance, that we've done this together. Those are the things that will help us weather these next storms too. And I think for many people, I hope for many people, it has been a revelation that we're not in the same boat. And I keep using these analogies because I don't know the words to actually say it, but that we all have our own stories that we're going through. But we have that underlying commonness now of being through a very difficult time together. And the things that we did to connect with each other and to support each other are what we can keep doing to get us through this next crisis. Because we cannot go back to 2 years ago and pretend this didn't happen. We need to recognize that there are things that we have seen now that we need to address, and climate change is one of them. Reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation, is another one that we need to really use this common experience to move ahead in a way that we have not done before. So I think that these core common traits that we now have as a community are the things that we need to continue to build on.
Yeah. And I was really struck by your comment about the way in which the pandemic really starkly revealed the injustices and inequities in our society, and that kind of call to action now, and with the almost daily now tragic news about more unmarked graves of indigenous children, there is a feeling that we're at this sort of moment of reckoning now as a country, and the kind of qualities you mentioned, the things that have brought us together, hopefully will equip us in dealing with those challenges moving forward as well.
I have seen some really positive movement in that area, and I said when this first came up in Kamloops that there are no words to describe it. Yeah. But I think it validates what has been known by many, many people, the First Nations people who attended residential schools. And we can't pretend it didn't happen anymore. And we need to recognize that we're in a place where change has happened, and we need to move ahead in a positive way, but we can do it together.
Yes, yes. If I could just switch tracks a little bit and talk about some of the reactions you've got. We did read in the news media about some of the harassment you sort of faced online, and I just wonder how you dealt with that personally, and how you also dealt with it as a team, and how you kept your team motivated, because everybody's been working so hard on all of this, and you talked about the exhaustion that's out there, and the last thing you need is that sort of threat out there as well. So what helped you get through that? What helps you get through that?
Well, part of it is that I do have a very strong team who are amazing, and I'm very aware that I also represent a strong public health community here in BC, and that's both a burden and something I'm very proud of. But those are the things that are hardest, is when there are personal attacks on me, often because I'm a woman, because I'm the face of things. I will say that I try and protect my team, and we try and protect each other, and we've been very lucky. We have a good team of support that helps us, and I'm very grateful to the RCMP have also been helpful to support our team. But these are the things that I'm not alone in facing, and my counterparts across the country have been facing some of the same vitriol. And I just try and remind ourselves that it is people lashing out because they're tired and they're angry, and they've lost something, and they have anxiety and fear, and that's how some people respond to a crisis. It is very distressing that we see a lot of it being magnified, particularly people picking up on things happening in the U.S. in a different scale than what we see in Canada, and that can be very hurtful. And I guess I do believe that most people are lashing out because they want to feel connected to another like-minded people online, and it's not really about me. But sometimes it can be very hurtful and frightening, to be honest.
It must have been, and I imagine as well, that you've, having dealt, for instance, with Ebola, you obviously have had to learn to deal with fear. There was so much fear around that, around Ebola generally. So how do you manage in those kinds of situations?
A lot of fear is not knowing. It's not understanding what's happening, and being in northern Uganda and Gulu, where people were dying from this strange disease, and you did see that fear, and that's where I learned how important it was to communicate, and how important it was to give people the information that you knew, to give them the means to do what you wanted them to do, and that whole importance of caring for the community. And many of the different groups that we've reached out to through this crises are because we know that in a crisis people need support of faith communities. And so I've spent quite a lot of time talking with faith leaders about how to support their communities. And it really is trying to magnify that, that connectivity that we need to help us get through a crisis. But fear really comes from not knowing. And with a pestilence like we have, you can't see it and you don't, there's so many things that we don't know. Fear can lead to gaps where misinformation gets filled in and disinformation. There's people intentionally trying to frighten others from doing things or not doing things. So it really is about providing as much as you know, as soon as you know it, in a clear and straightforward way. And I've learned that when I try and nuance things, it just makes people more anxious. So trying to be very steadfast and clear in how we communicate things is important.
Well, I think you've done an extraordinary job on that because, as you mentioned, you've had to provide guidance and leadership in a context with partial information, a lot of uncertainty, incredible ambiguity, and layering on all the anxiety. And you've provided a level of clarity, I think, which has been extraordinary. And so perhaps if you haven't always provided the ultimate nuance on something, that's been to the good generally. The other thing I've noticed in terms of your approach and your style is you are not afraid to show emotion. And you get emotional.
I do.
And, at that recent sort of announcement about the kind of reopening or moving, into a new phase, you were visibly emotional. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and the importance of showing emotion, but also perhaps a more general reflection on kind of emotional intelligence and leadership.
Yeah, I guess I've always been somebody who has been quite emotional, cries a lot at the drop of a hat. And I think it partly it goes back to compassion. It goes back to actually understanding other people's suffering. And early on, I was quite emotional because it triggered so many memories of SARS when we had the first case and death in a long-term care home. And it just, the knowledge of what could be coming our way and what was coming our way was very heavy for me. For this last one, it really, it surprised me that I became emotional when I was talking about the restart. But I think it was thinking through the enormity of what we have been through, that it has been, 18 months, and that people's worlds have changed. There's been children born, people have died, there's been transitions that we have changed and postponed, and it just really, it was a sense of heaviness from that, but lightness, because we were in such a good place, and I had faith in the protection that we were getting from vaccines, and that this was truly going to be a different place that we were going to.
Yeah. Well, I experienced that too. I mean, you talked about the lightness you felt when you got your first vaccination. I certainly felt that, and then getting the second vaccination even more. And then that reopening as well, for the reasons you mentioned. I felt very emotional that day, and we had a very small in-person outdoor event on campus last week, and it just felt very emotional. So I sort of understand where all that comes from.
To see people again in real.
In real, and it's kind of a little awkward almost, not quite knowing how to interact, so we'll have to relearn some of that. I think now we're going to turn to some audience questions, and I have a first question from Jennifer on Facebook, and she asks, what one thing assisted you in holding your vision day in and day out? So what one thing?
One thing. Sense of humor? I think it really was just that feeling that this was what we needed to do, and that it was that feeling of, the word's not obligation, but I guess duty, that this was the place we needed to go, and that if we could do it together, it would minimize the trauma on all of us. And I don't know, I just...
Yeah, so that sense of sort of duty and common purpose kind of drove you. Yeah.
That this was my role in this common journey that we were on.
Yeah. Well, we were so lucky that you were there at the time, at this time when we so needed you. We have another question from Kathy, who asks, have you considered how your leadership style influenced pandemic response in BC?
You know, this is one of the things that people compare what happened here in BC to other provinces, other countries. And, you know, I just am very grateful. The government decided that they were going to let us be part of the team to lead. And that the voice of how we would approach this, and you know, to his credit, Minister Dix is a very compassionate and intelligent man. That really, we were partners in this. It wasn't always easy. Yeah. We didn't always agree on things, and I can be stubborn apparently. But we developed a relationship where we talked about everything. That we presented the information to government. We consulted a lot with our team, but at the end of the day, it really was the ultimate decision making was with the minister, myself, and I have to give all credit to Dr. Stephen Brown, who's the Deputy Minister of Health, because it really was a team approach, and that I'm very grateful for. I think it is to their credit that they recognize that this was the way that we wanted to go in BC, and it's made a difference for us, I believe.
Yeah. No, and that is so evident when you do look at what's happening in some other jurisdictions and outside of Canada too. I've got family, you know, who live in other countries, and you know, in places where there's been sort of strong political interference, it's been really quite challenging. So I think we've been very fortunate here in BC. We have a question from Carrie. If we applied the same pandemic response to the opioid crisis, could we sway public opinion?
You know, and the overdose crisis or the toxic drug crisis is, as you know, a public health emergency as well that has been a large part of my life for the last 5 years. And sadly, this pandemic has exposed a lot of the challenges that we had in supporting people who use drugs. And I think one of the positive things that has come out of that is we have swayed opinion in many ways. We've recognized and we've tried to humanize people who use drugs, that it's not just those people, it's our community, our family, our friends. And that has become more and more apparent to many, many families across this province. And we've made some progress in trying to address safer supply, prescribed safer supply, trying to address decriminalization of people so that we can overcome that stigma. And I do believe we've made some progress, but nothing is fast enough. And it is another one of those complex crises where there is no one single solution. But we need now, it's another one of those things that we need to put this resolve to not go back and to move forward and to address it. And that is something that I'm putting a lot of effort and time into now too.
Yeah. You know, you mentioned earlier on, you know, that common purpose and the way in which we dramatically changed our lives to deal with this pandemic. And I imagine that's sort of one of the lessons we've kind of learned and hopefully can apply to a crisis like the overdose crisis as well. There's a question from Tamara. Tamara says, thank you for your science-based decision-making. In public health, a lot of responses are cultural and emotional. And she asks, how did your work overseas influence some of the decisions in the Canadian culture? That's an interesting question.
It is an interesting culture. I almost think, you know, how does my Canadianness influence the work that I did overseas? And we learn from both of those. But I'm not sure there is one Canadian culture. We are a society, a community that's made up of many different voices and backgrounds, and it goes back again to what I was saying, that all of our stories are different, and our journeys through this past 18 months are different. And I would say that science, the epidemiology, the data, that part of it is what underpins the decisions that we make, but it has to be put in the context of the lived reality that each community has. And we've not always got that right in the language sometimes, and we're looking at that now around the vaccination programs. How do we reach some people who have different questions and a different language, whether it's a scientific language or an actual dialect that's different? How do we provide people with the information they need, but also how do we just make it easy for people? And in different communities, that means different things. So I think recognizing that there's no one way that you can provide information to people to help them get through the crises, to help them make those decisions, and that you have to find multiple different ways in people to do that is something that I've learned in my overseas work, but also here.
Yeah, and given the diversity of Canada, I mean, I think that is the only workable approach. We have a question from Gwen. This is a good question. So how do you take care of yourself while caring for everyone else?
Oh, I'm very lucky. I have a very strong, connected group of friends, not all of whom, actually most of whom don't live in the same place that I'm in. And I have sisters. I have a lot of sisters. And my sisters are very well connected. So those are my biological sisters, but also some really strong friendships. And that makes all the difference for me. I am somebody that doesn't sleep very well. But I also try and do a few things for myself. And running is one of them, keeping physically active. And also I meditate. I think it's... I try and make a few minutes every day to take some deep breaths. Yeah,
I find when the pandemic started, I started doing yoga, my own yoga every morning, just for a few minutes. Same thing, and it really made a huge difference. And
I'm actually missing my yoga.
yeah. Well, I kind of learned how to do yoga myself, and I've become quite addicted to it now. And like so many other Canadians and other people, I bought an e-bike too. So commuting into work.
Okay, now I'm jealous. I've been looking at bikes. Yeah. I will say that one of my little anecdotes, something that's when it was decided that I needed to have security for, I said, okay, fine, then we're going running, because I hadn't been able to go running, particularly in the dark. So that's been one positive thing that's happened.
Oh, good. Good. And we have a question from Peter. And Peter's asking, how concerned are you about COVID variants, and are we ready?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I think we need to continue to put in perspective is that viruses change. That's the nature of what they are. They're small little bits of genetic material, and this one's an RNA virus, so it's only a single strand, and that means it doesn't have a spell checker. So it changes all the time. And every now and then, one of those mutations will give it an advantage, a survival advantage. And that's what these variants that we're seeing now are. It gives them, they're more transmissible, so they latch onto the ACE receptors in our nose and throat more easily, or something like that, that makes them more transmissible. It doesn't change the fact that it's the same virus. And this is the wonders of science, right? We're actually watching this evolution in real time for the first time ever, because we have this really cool stuff called whole genome sequencing, which means that we can actually sequence the viruses really quickly, and we're doing that with every virus. Every person who's infected with a virus here in BC who has a positive test, we do a whole genome sequencing. So we know exactly which strain or which variation of the virus is circulating. But it's still the same virus, and it's infecting people, and it's transmitted between people. And the very same things that we know work to prevent transmission of the viruses that was infecting people a few months ago work against all of the variants that we're seeing right now. There may not be as much leeway if we have lapses of those, so we have to be more careful. And so far we know that the vaccines are working very well to protect people, no matter what strain of the virus we're seeing. So the important thing right now is get vaccinated, to stay away from others if you're sick, and we're going to be continuing to do that public health work, which is following every case, making sure we know where it's being transmitted, keeping sick people away from well people, and keeping people away from others when they're in the at-risk period, and that's how we'll get through this. Yes, we're going to see more cases as more people travel, as we have more introductions of virus. But the more we are protected through immunization, it's not going to spread and affect society the way it did even a few months ago.
Right. And I guess, while we've seen, a very successful vaccination rollout here, of course, until many other parts of the world are successful, we will still be looking at these outbreaks. And
that's correct.
Yeah.
And, we now have to really consider our duty internationally to protect the world, because we will continue to be at risk until the virus stops circulating in rapid spread in other parts of the world, because every time it replicates, there's a chance that a new mutation is going to arise that will give it some other advantage.
Do you remain confident that, that the plan in BC, the reopening plan, can proceed as laid out? And
I am. We're in a good path. We're now 2 weeks or so after we went to this next step.
Yes.
We're seeing a lot more people who are actually getting out. But with the high level of protection we're seeing from immunization, we're in a good place. It doesn't mean we can let down our guard completely yet. We've seen, like from the Euro Cup, when large crowds get together, it does still transmit, particularly in unvaccinated people. And right now, the most unvaccinated people are young people who are much more connected.
Yeah.
So we still need to be careful about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for one last question, and it's a question from Alana. And this is something which I think you'll enjoy answering. What would you tell girls and young women considering careers in science?
Yes.
Yes, do it.
And I think we sometimes sell ourselves short. And I hear this from the young people in my life, that there's still this stigma that girls aren't good at math and girls aren't good at science. And I say, be a nerd. It's okay. It's exciting. You can be good at math and sciences. And there's really fun stuff in science and epidemiology and, the disease detective work that we do behind the scenes. It is exciting and fun, and I think I would encourage all young people. But I also think that, to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, always keep the arts in there too.
Yes.
When I went to university, I took sciences, but I always took an arts course, and for me it was around books and literature. But we need to have both sides of it, to be able to understand the science and the human nature that helps us get through things like this pandemic.
Yeah, and so many of these challenges have a cognitive element as well. It's persuading people. Like climate change is a big cognitive element. In addition, obviously, to the technological solutions and scientific solutions as well. Well, that was our last question from the audience. So it's now my great pleasure to thank you, Dr. Henry. Thank you for joining us today. But thank you for your extraordinary leadership here in this province. I know you've been featured in the New York Times and you've been spoken about internationally, and we are so proud that you are one of us here, and for your incredible guidance through all of this. It's made a world of difference, and you should know how deeply appreciative we all are. But thank you for joining the Changemakers Speaker Series today. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, the Victoria Times Colonist. And of course, events like this don't just happen, so I want to thank the Royal Road staff who helped to coordinate this wonderful event as well. And for the Speaker Series, we're going to take a bit of a break through the summer, and hoping that all of you out there can join us for the next event in this series in September, and hopefully it will be an in-person event, but we will see. So with that, I just want to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you so much for being with us. So thank you, and thanks again.
Thank you.